like to say first, welcome to the session on preventing the spread of predatory housing schemes on this wonderful Thursday morning. We're excited about the summit and we're excited that you're here. My name is Twala Guest and I work with the City of Memphis Division of Housing and Community Development as the administrator of the Affordable Housing Department, and I will be introducing your speakers and moderator for this session. Our first speaker is Tyra Roach, who is the Home Financing Manager with Pew Charitable Trust. She is the Research Manager with Pew's Home Financing Project, where she conducts original analysis of safety, affordability, and availability of small mortgages and alternative financial arrangements, which are used to purchase manufactured homes and other low-cost forms of housing. Her previous work includes research on everyday financial products, including small dollar loans, mobile payments, and student loans to inform policy recommendations that protect consumers from harmful practices and promote safe, transparent credit, which is great. Also, Ms. Roach holds a bachelor's degree in English from the College of New Jersey and a master's in public policy from Rutgers University. Welcome, Ms. Roach. Next speaker will be Mr. Darrell Smith, who is a Memphis native and focuses his practice in bankruptcy law as a senior staff attorney for Sylvia Ford Brown, Chapter 13, trustee for the Western District of Tennessee in Memphis. As the senior staff attorney, he is responsible for examining all Chapter 13 cases filed as they are assigned to his case trustee. Prior to becoming Chapter 13 staff attorney, he resided and practiced law in the state of Mississippi and has effectively served as an assistant district attorney in Hinds, Holmes, Humphreys, and Yazoo counties in the state of Mississippi. He has prosecuted and tried more than 36 criminal cases, from malicious mischief cases to capital murder cases. Wow. Mr. Smith is a member of the Memphis Bar Association and the National Bar Association. He practices law in Tennessee and Mississippi, and he is also a graduate of Murray State University and Mississippi College School of Law. All right, so welcome to Mr. Smith. Next, I will introduce our moderator for this morning's session, who is Amy Shaflin, and she is the Executive Director of United Housing, as she joined United Housing in January 2018 with a vision to increase access to financial and economic self-sufficiency. Also, her vision includes increasing financing options for families and build new homes in the Memphis market. She has a master's in urban anthropology from the University of Memphis and a wealth of knowledge gained by working at University Neighborhood Development Corporation and also Tennessee Housing Development Agency, which we know as THDA. She has brought United Housing into its 25th year by breaking records with helping over 1,000 individuals with their dream of home ownership and financial stability. Amy sits on the board of Build Memphis, Tennessee Affordable Housing Coalition, and Advisory Council for Federal Home Loan Bank of Cincinnati. So welcome to our moderator as well. I have completed with the introductions, and I would like to say that everybody enjoy the session on this morning, as well as the rest of the summit on today. And you all have a great day, and I will now turn it over into the hands of our moderator, Amy Shaflin. Thank you.
All right. Can y'all hear me okay? All right. So thank you so much, Torla, and thank you to the City of Memphis Housing and Community Development for putting on this great summit. And so I'll just start briefly by introducing United Housing, and then we'll get into kind of what we've seen as a housing counseling agency in terms of predatory housing schemes, and then hand it over to Tara. So United Housing is a 25-year-old nonprofit housing provider, and we have a goal to improve the financial well-being and increase access to wealth-building opportunities for residents of the Mid-South. We do this through property ownership and home ownership, but also stable, affordable housing. We build and repair houses. We are a nonprofit lender, and we're a housing counseling agency. Our housing counselors work with individuals across our city to increase financial security to become homeowners. And we also provide a post-purchase education session, and that's all about home maintenance and the proper documentation to will your property, as well as in a section that we call protecting your investment. because homes are often the largest investment that individuals will make. So in many of our communities, home financing options are not as accessible. For example, mortgage loans under $100,000 are less likely to be funded, and properties in substandard condition are unlikely to get enough capital to make them habitable. United Housing offers loans that may help achieve homeownership for first-time home buyers through our small dollar mortgage program called the Cherry Mortgage. And we increase access to capital for rental property owners as well to make the much needed repairs to their rental units. In cases where financing is not available, however, property owners rely on hard money loans with exorbitant interest rates and sometimes predatory schemes like land installment contracts. Our housing counselors and our partner agencies across the city have seen homeowners try to borrow against their home only to find out that they do not actually own their home because it's not recorded in their name. And eventually learning that they have been a victim of the land installment contract, where they are paying high costs to maintain a unit that they do not legally own. So today we will discuss the spread and effects of predatory housing schemes. These schemes are dangerous strategies that take the idea of home ownership or property transactions and use them to extract capital from communities of color, the elderly, and many others. Today we hope to learn how to spot these predatory agreements and then protect your neighbors from these wealth extraction tools that are really common in our city. And so we'll start with Tara Roach with the Pew Charitable Trusts. Tara, I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of talk about the reasons why people may find themselves in these predatory schemes, and then what those outcomes and impacts might be. So take it away, Tara.
Thanks so much, Amy, for that introduction, and Twarl as well, and to the city for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'm very excited to chat with you all about our research and some of these issues that we're seeing across the country. So I just want to make sure that you can all see the presentation that I have up. Double check. Okay, hearing nothing to say you can't. I assume that's up. Okay. All right, great. So I'll just talk for a quick second about Pew and our work in this space, and then dig right into the project itself. So for those who haven't heard of us before, Pew is a 501c3 nonprofit, and I sit in a part of Pew that works on what we broadly call family finances. And there's a range of projects in there that cover student loans, retirement savings. The project we launched last year called Home Financing. The goal of that project is to look at the dearth of small mortgages across the country. So as Amy mentioned, funding low-cost homes, small mortgages, it's really difficult in many parts of the country. And so we want to understand a little bit more about what's going on there and what the challenges are for lenders making those and for borrowers to access them. And, when people can't access those, some of them are going to alternative financing. And so what do those experiences look like? How are people getting into those loans? What are the pathways? And what are the outcomes? Do people actually end up purchasing or receiving that contract or deed on the back end? Or does it end up stripping a lot of equity payments from the family and from the home? And obviously that's a lot of what we've heard and what we're seeing across the country. And that seems to be the case, of course, that you're all discussing in Memphis. And lastly, just to note that we're looking at arrangements on site-built homes as well as manufactured homes. These aren't always included in the discussions around low-cost housing, but they are the most common type of naturally occurring or market rate affordable housing. And there's been a lot of discussion about the promise of that sector expanding because they can be built well and quickly, but it's very hard to get financing on those low-cost homes as well. So a quick agenda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the definitions that identifying the types and the definitions of alternative financing broadly. We'll get into land contracts specifically. Specific challenges for manufactured home residents who are using something other than a mortgage to pay for the home. Some recent related policies at the federal and state levels. And then I believe Amy's going to drive Q&A a little later. So people typically pay for their homes with mortgages, of course, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of difficulty in getting some mortgages below $150,000. Some possible hurdles that we've been hearing about across the country, some regulatory barriers there, fixed origination costs. It's very expensive to make a small mortgage relative to a large one. They're actually about the same price. And so lenders are pretty heavily incentivized to make larger balance loans because the cost there is going to be the same, whether it's a small mortgage or a large mortgage. And so they're just incentivized to do larger balance loans. And we want to understand more about what those challenges are and what those incentives are. And through research, see if there's ways to drive down those costs and make it more accessible for borrowers to access these who are looking for low-cost homes. So the way we have defined this umbrella term of alternative home financing, and that includes all of the arrangements you've all discussed, scams, anything that people are using that's not a mortgage to finance the purchase of their home. So land contracts, contracts for deed, lease purchase or rent-to-own arrangements, personal property, home only or chattel loans on manufactured homes specifically, and then seller financed mortgages. And so for those who haven't heard of these arrangements before, I just do this quick visualization to really demonstrate what the kind of key differences between mortgages and alternative home financing. So in a mortgage, you typically have 3, maybe 4 parties with the title company. And so the seller is handing over, right, the home and the title or deed to the buyer. And the buyer is sending their note or contract and their payments to the bank or other party. The seller receives their proceeds from the sale, and that's it. Typically, the seller and the buyer don't have any engagement beyond that. However, in an alternative financial arrangement where there's not a third party like a mortgage lender or some other entity that's acting as a liaison, what often happens is, yes, the buyer sends down payment and regular payments, but it goes straight to the seller this time. And the seller also retains that note or contract and the title or deed. The buyer gets the house. So the big difference here is that title or deed. Who does it sit with? So even though the buyer in both instances is effectively trying to finance the purchase of their home, because they don't have that title or deed in hand, it makes it really hard to identify who's actually legally considered the homeowner. So you can imagine when it comes to borrowing against your home for education or for shocks or other things that come up that you need to pay for, if you need to repair the home, any other reason you would need to access any of the equity in the home, very hard to demonstrate when you don't have a title or deed that has your name on it. And in so many of the arrangements, the seller keeps that, and that doesn't get transferred until the end of the contractual period. And this is especially true for land contracts. That is by far like the defining feature of land contracts, where title or deed is not handed over. And it creates a lot of issues with encumbrances and taxes and rights and responsibilities, who's responsible for upkeep, repairs, and so on. Alternative financing is widespread. You will find it in all states in some form or fashion. Lease purchase, seller finance mortgages, we've seen evidence of those across most states in the country. Sometimes it's not a lot, depending on the state law. Other times, some states have a much higher concentration of these. Personal property loans for manufactured homes are also pretty widespread, but they're mostly concentrated in the Sun Belt. And I'll dig into kind of the manufactured housing piece a little bit in a few minutes. And land contracts are definitely more common in certain regions. Midwest and the Southeast are particularly more likely to have land contracts or contract for deed arrangements. Some of this might be driven by A, historic practices with redlining, but B, recordation requirements in some of those states. The existing laws today vary pretty widely. So contracts are usually governed at the state and local level. Statutes, ordinances, or even case law from the courts will define what those kinds of arrangements are. About half of states have laws. Most of those laws are usually on land contracts. The lease purchase, other kinds of arrangements, seller finance mortgages, far less likely to see laws that govern those. They tend to be treated as a contract between seller and buyer. No law in Tennessee. I will mention towards the end, there are a couple of bills that have been introduced this year, but I haven't seen much movement there. And in some states, the borrowers are treated as tenants, sometimes as homeowners. Responsibilities, as I mentioned before, for upkeep and consumer protections are often unclear. So that makes it very difficult for borrowers or buyers to know their rights and responsibilities. And sometimes in the seller's case, this can happen too. And so just to underscore some of the risks to these groups of folks. So risks to buyers: lack of equity, unclear ownership, threats of eviction or foreclosure are particularly pervasive. The home quality may vary widely for these homes. Sometimes it's not that the borrower can't access a mortgage. Sometimes the home itself doesn't qualify for one because of the condition. We've also seen evidence of unforeseen costs and fees, not being able to borrow against the home, as I'd mentioned. And as I'll talk about in a minute, the inability to access federal and state assistance, especially during the pandemic, has been really hard for people in alternative financing. And I'll just tease that we did a nationally representative survey a few months ago to ask American adults if they've ever used anything other than a mortgage to pay for their loans. And we'll have findings coming out soon, but it is millions of people who have used something other than a mortgage. And we're really looking forward to digging in and understanding more about disparities across that and thinking holistically about how people are accessing mortgages versus something else and what that looks like across the country. So stay tuned. Risks to seller, pretty minimal. In many places, in the event of non-payment, a seller can often evict the buyer. And again, it varies by state law. Some places have more protections than others, but this has often been a very common feature. And risk to state and local government. As I mentioned, it's unclear who's responsible for taxes and maintenance. It can lead to reduced home values, dilapidated homes. It's also hard to target resources during a pandemic or other natural event. So just wanted to touch base very quickly on manufactured housing. And just to note that alternative financing does exist on other forms of housing stock as well, not just site-built. So today's newer manufactured homes look very different than what people often think as older mobile homes that were built prior to the federal government's rules and regulations that defined the quality of these homes. So they do look a lot more like site-built. They have pitched, peaked roofs, as you can see. But what we really want to understand here is that even though manufactured housing is, like over vast parts of the country, right? Definitely concentrated more in rural areas. It tends to be a larger share of that housing stock. You do see it across the country, even in metro areas. About half of manufactured homes are in a metro area. And the darker blue areas just on this map show more concentration of manufactured housing. But a lot of challenges come along with ownership and titling. So for example, if I went to buy a manufactured home in most states, that comes to me as personal property, kind of like a car, even if I own the land underneath the home. So now I own the home and I own the land. In a site-built home, I would own all of it together. But in a manufactured home arrangement, in most places, I have to go through the cumbersome process of retitling the home as real property, then getting it affixed to the land itself. And it can be very difficult to do that. And because it doesn't show up as real property when you first purchase it, the only financing available is a personal property loan or something that's not a mortgage. Far more expensive for people, even when they could have qualified for a mortgage. This is just an example of a little home in a community. So whether you own the land or not, personal property loans or rents are often what's available. So a quick comparison. I just want to point out here that this bottom right figure, $37,000, this is the amount that a personal property loan borrower would have paid in interest compared to someone who'd had a mortgage over a 20-year loan. So on a loan for $70,000 over 20 years, they would pay an additional $37,000 on average in interest, even though they could have reasonably received a mortgage. Another thing I want to point out is that financing varies pretty widely by state, race, and ethnicity. And again, we want to spend some time digging into, bring up that graphic. While populations are more likely to use these expensive personal property loans versus mortgages, because you do see a lot of variation across states, and definitely it depends on not only the share of housing in that community, but also if it's a rural location, metro, there's a lot of factors that go into it. And the titling laws as well, that can really limit people's options if they can't convert that home immediately to real property. So for example, you can see here the blue parts of all of these pie charts, that shows where someone got a mortgage, a manufactured home mortgage, a little bit different than a site built, but more protective than a personal property or chattel loan. And then the orange shares of the pie charts are personal property or chattel loans. So you can see how much they vary across the states. So we want to understand why in some states people are able to access a mortgage versus a personal property or chattel loan. What's driving that? Because it definitely results in very different outcomes for people. So a couple of changes really quick. Some of these are at the federal level, but I just think it's kind of important to note that some of these things are happening nationally because they do affect state and local jurisdictions as well. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are currently working on new plans for their duty to serve regulations, and this requires them to pay specific attention and help expand the market for financing in low-cost communities and in manufactured communities and other underserved areas of the country. And we've submitted comments, especially around manufactured housing and the kinds of financing that people can access there. There's also been some tenant rights and bills introduced. I also want to note the Treasury's Homeowner Assistance Fund. What was interesting about this new funding that homeowners can receive is that they define eligibility as homeowner as being someone who has a land contract or a loan on their manufactured home. And you don't often see people who are in land contracts included in really important legislation and guidance like this. So it's really neat to see that Treasury acknowledge groups of folks around the country who are in something other than a mortgage. So I think the discussion around land contracts is starting to, the profile of the issue is starting to increase. There's more awareness around this. So it's a really good time to be having conversations like this because, you know, we can absolutely highlight this for, you know, state and federal officials who have guidance under them where they're putting forth, you know, legislation or rules that gets funding into the hands of homeowners who really need it. And these are folks who are, you know, during the pandemic were more likely to be in employment where they felt a lot more of the shocks in terms of dips in their income and job losses. And so I think it's really great that they've included land contracts in their homeowner definitions and not just typically mortgages. And also, just to note as well, there's movement at the city and states. Tennessee introduced a couple of bills this year on land contracts. A number of other states have been adjusting their policies around what kind of housing, how housing is titled, other kinds of zoning changes. Land contract legislation is popping up across a number of states. With Treasury's new assistance fund as well, states are putting forth these different proposals to say that, yes, we do treat people who have land contracts as being equitable to mortgages. So great to see a lot of this discussion and movement happening at the state and federal level. Okay, so a few quick takeaways, and then, you know, I'm excited to chat more with folks. Low-cost homes are available, but it's difficult for people to get the financing they need, especially for Hispanic, Black, and Indigenous communities. Millions of people have used something other than a mortgage. These are often riskier. The protections vary very widely across states, and we'll be putting out some research in the coming months to talk more about that. Federal and state assistance often excludes people who use alternative financing, but great to see some movement from recent guidance. And manufactured housing, most common type of unsubsidized affordable housing. But again, titling and other challenges there affects the kind of financing, and it's difficult for a lot of folks to get a mortgage to pay for those homes. So I will stop there and hand it back over. And thank you again for having me join today. I really am looking forward to this chat.
Thanks, Tara. And I think we'll get to some of the questions at the end. So I'll go ahead and just turn it over to Daryl. Daryl, will you tell us more about what you've seen in your work around these predatory housing schemes and maybe what, you know, that may mean for more locally for Memphis?
All right, thank you, Amy. I was in a hearing this morning dealing with a similar issue. I'm a native Memphian, Memphis City School graduate, so I've seen the city change. It kind of started with, we had a mortgage crisis back in 2008. then a job loss would happen with someone, and that's how you end up generally in bankruptcy. Particularly in this city, over 80% of the debtors are African American. That's not representative of the city population necessarily, but that's generally how the debt lies for different reasons. And we have a lot of heir property as well. So a lot of people die without a will. They don't probate it. And more so our North Memphis, South Memphis area, some of the older homes, gentrifications happen as well. So the property value does go up, but they sell it to a company and they get into a rent to own type of situation since there wasn't a title. For example, the traditional mortgages that we would like to see is just rural housing, which we don't have too many of in the city, and just a straight flatline mortgage. But the rent to own issue, similar to what Tara sees, the title issue, you can get to the end of your bankruptcy case or just the end of that term. If the contract default happens or any type of issue, it's kind of hard to quiet that title. But in the debtor's education concept, when we try to tell people to kind of stay away from them, if you do get into a mortgage situation, the shorter the term in the rent to own, the better. There should be a default provision, especially in this city. Generally, you should look under your budget. Even if you can afford $2,000, for instance, I always try to keep it under your budget. And the best example in those rent to owns, sometimes you can pay it early. We have people with personal injury lawsuits. Generally, if you get $100,000, you can buy the home outright. They hand you over the title. You can win the lottery. Those are rare case scenarios. We've had people borrow from their 401k to pay it off. But the issue we see with rent to own in this city is that a lot of people, if you default, there's no recourse since you don't have the title. Specifically around the Stax Museum area in this city, that's been revitalized. It's a rock climbing place, a museum, but their property values went up. Another example, the Crosstown area, going up Cleveland for the local people here, their values went up, but companies bought them and they're doing the rent to own. But if they default, they can just do another contract with someone and do another rent to own issue. So in the bankruptcy concept as well, it's hard to get recourse. Going back with Tara, you don't have a title. You can't access any equity. We generally base value in bankruptcy concept on per the tax assessor value. So any equity still goes to that company or the individual who holds title to the land. A way we get around that is we try to stay away from them. So with a traditional mortgage, you should put 30% of your income should go to the mortgage. Your pre-tax income is kind of the standard. I read a study from the Pew Foundation that's a little higher now due to student loans. A lot of Memphians have student loans from teachers to professional attorneys like myself. So if you have a $100,000 mortgage and a $100,000 student loan, 50% of your income generally goes to those two debts, essentially. Also, the mortgage should only be 40% max is the recommendation of your income after taxes. Look at the down payment. Generally, people don't think about the 20% down. If you don't put 20% down in a standard mortgage, you'll have purchase money insurance. Usually, there are different types of mortgages. Once again, a HELOC or they have professional mortgage. We always recommend that you escrow the property. You don't have to. Most mortgages make you do it, but some people forget about the taxes that are due for the county and city every year, and that can become an issue. And it's also down payment assistance program. I know HUD has them, the city has some. A lot of the elderly people in the city, the tax freeze, they need to look into that information. There have been multiple grants. My grandmother stayed in off Chelsea Avenue. They put a new roof on her home, helped fix the gas line. Those are different avenues as well. And always get a home inspection as well. But with the predatory lending, going back into that, a lot of people don't have those protections since you don't have that title. So the emergency fund, you fix the property, you pay for everything. A job loss, you miss 3 payments. It usually takes about 90 days. I know Tara mentioned foreclosures. You generally don't have to foreclose. Tennessee, this county particularly has a landlord-tenant act, but you're treated more of a renter. And Memphis is predominantly a renter city for the minorities in the city. So those are different things we look into. Also, going back into more the financial literacy aspect of it, there's a program with the city, Bank on Memphis. When we do our debtors education, we have people come out. We need people to get bank accounts, raise those credit scores to avoid them. But regardless, you need a place to stay. The recommendation on behalf of the bankruptcy world is to avoid them if you can, but the shorter the term of a rent to own type of situation, the better. 10 years, 15 years or less. If you do default on a payment, have some type of recourse and seek legal counsel. And that's it for now. I'll hand it back over to you, Amy, see if we have any questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Daryl. Yeah, it was such a strange housing market recently, with people getting big bidding wars when they're trying to buy a home. And we saw clients not getting home inspections. And, our housing counselors, when we teach home buyer education, never not get a home inspection. So these are the things that, like you mentioned, Bank on Memphis, there are other housing counseling agencies in the city. Always talk with someone if you're looking to get into a homeownership situation, or if you are looking to get in a rent-to-own situation, definitely talk with a housing counselor or get some legal help through legal aid, Memphis Area Legal Services, and others. So thank you so much. I did want to ask quickly about how one of the things that's hard to track, not necessarily the impact. We know what the impact of a lot of these predatory schemes can have, but it's really hard to track these schemes. So if we did want to come up with some kind of state or local law, what is the prevalence of them? So do you have any advice, or are there ways to identify and track some of these predatory housing schemes like land installment contracts? To either one of you.
I would suggest they are hard to file, but I think a survey would be the best way. I don't know how you would distribute this survey. With the land installment contracts, they're private matters and they're not necessarily a record. But when people transfer title, that'll be the easiest way, the success to measure success of a rent to own, see how many titles were transferred that way, and possibly a survey. In the bankruptcy concept, it's hard for us to track it. Most of the bankruptcies in the Chapter 13, only about 30% succeed. So that's kind of a very small margin. And then we do see those. It's only about 400 of 8,000 cases that have that type of mortgage situation going on. So it's a very small number compared to the city as a whole.
And I'll just add to Daryl's comment there that what I can say is what other states do is have explicit laws that require recordation of these contracts. A couple of states have something in it's something about their case law that effectively encourages people to record these deeds. We partnered with the National Consumer Law Center to conduct a 50-state law scan, essentially to learn what laws govern these kinds of arrangements. And that's where we learned that about half of states have something on land contracts, but about half of those, so probably about a dozen or so, have recordation requirements. So it's not many, but in order to even get a handle on where these exist, who has and how many there are, that's all I've seen states do, save for, again, maybe there was a court decision that, I think there's one court case in a state that said, basically, if these aren't recorded, if you go to court over them, they're not considered valid. And so in that sense, there is this incentive for people to record them up front. So a bit of it depends on the states, but by and large, most places have recorded the contracts. And then it just, like a mortgage or other agreement would, it goes to your local county or city, wherever that is, recorder of deeds, and is on public record. Survey is also a great idea. I was a big fan of surveys.
Yes. So Tara, I'm going to stay with you. You mentioned a little bit in your research how it highlighted some of the disparities that these predatory schemes can have on renters. There are some state laws that treat renters with certain persons who are trying to achieve home ownership through alternative financing. Can you tell us about how that and how it relates to some of the COVID-19 rental assistance?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Amy. So as I mentioned in the presentation, people who are using alternative financing are treated very differently by state law across the states. So in some states, they fall under landlord-tenant laws, and those might be better and more protective. but it doesn't quite capture the kinds of arrangement they have. So, for example, we see this a fair amount with land contracts or with rent-to-own or lease purchase laws, where the state just sort of by default treats them as if they were in a landlord-tenant arrangement because the state doesn't consider them homeowners. But if you're on your way to homeownership, then who's legally responsible for any upkeep? Usually that would be the landlord. And in states where that law applies, maybe that's fine. But how do you account for that point at where you're supposed to turn into a homeowner? What law governs that? So it can be really complicated. And the way this has kind of borne out in some of the guidance we saw during the pandemic was some of the assistance coming down for homeowners and renters excluded all these other people, right? Mortgages and rents aren't the only way that people pay for their housing. They're using land contracts, rent to own, all these other arrangements. And we often forget that. It's really a spectrum of financing that people use to pay for their dwelling. And so, it would be great if policymakers and other officials who are implementing these just had a better sense for it, had the data to see like what else people are doing so that when they put forth guidance, they can be really thoughtful about who they're trying to capture, which is why I point to the Treasury guidance as a neat example of, how they've been able to expand what they define as a homeowner to say, yeah, it's also people with land contracts, and it's also people who have a loan on a manufactured home, even if it's not a mortgage, it's a homeowner in our definition. So it's great to see some of that movement. Certainly more work to do there, and we hope that we can keep providing some research to help inform those kinds of conversations.
Definitely. And Daryl, you mentioned some areas of Memphis specifically that have seen these predatory schemes happen more often. Can you talk about where the predatory housing schemes are happening in Memphis and how that really impacts, in the future for stable housing for Memphians?
Well, it's somewhat of a trickle-down effect. The areas that are being gentrified, and for good reason. Like I know St. Jude, a lot of the North Memphis uptown, they have programs. They allow their employees to buy those homes, but corporations will buy the plot of land even or build a home and do a rent-to-own project on there, since the value is not necessarily the home, but the land value went up. It provides people with the opportunity for a home, which they do need, but sometimes if you default, there's no recourse. And if there is, the problem we see is that they can't afford a lawyer, or they don't know what steps to take to try to enforce this contract. They just vacate the property, and the property is, another contract is signed, a new person comes in. That's what we're seeing. And some of it is the predatory scheme is kind of the person is uneducated. It's kind of a socioeconomic issue as well, where the property value, more so the land, is going up. They get the people to sign these contracts. That person defaults. We have some people who come deceased. They just reissue the contract, and they always hold the title, is what we're seeing in the bankruptcy arena.
And Tara, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, like the impact that these can have on families and in cities in general long term?
Yeah, we're actually over the next few months really going to spend some time digging into experiences and outcomes. What we've seen from the evidence we've gathered so far is that in some instances, people do have good experiences. They're in a rent-to-own arrangement. They have a good agreement with the landlord or the seller, and are able to, they're moving towards that home ownership. We don't know how many people have ended up actually getting the deed or the title. And I think part of the intention there is figuring out, what is your goal as a person who's trying to achieve home ownership? Was it being in a stable home, in a community where you could access the schooling and the amenities that you wanted? And what is your eventual home ownership goal? Are you okay in a situation where you're, it's a little kind of in a gray area where you're renting, moving towards home ownership, but you don't have a deed or a title in hand, and thinking through some of those risks and trade-offs and keeping in mind what, homeowners' own goals are. So it's a little bit hard trying to figure out what that line is, I think, through research because of the lack of data on outcomes. But a lot of the evidence we've seen has certainly pointed to many challenges that people have faced. So there are situations where folks are having good experience. We've seen some of that through our focus groups around the country. A lot of others There are dilapidated homes, and a lot of equity and wealth stripping goes on for families because they were evicted, and you don't get to keep any of those payments. You don't get to keep the payments you made to improve the home. If it was your responsibility per the agreement with you and the seller that you would maintain the home and pay the taxes. A lot of times we've seen, I think one of the things that is most often brings people to seek legal representation from like legal aid lawyers and organizations around the country are things like unpaid fees and taxes. Those shocks hit them, and all of a sudden they're getting these bills for things they haven't paid. They thought the seller or the landlord was responsible, but they weren't paying it, and now they're on the hook for that. Or they missed a payment and they're being threatened with eviction, and no right to cure, or there's some kind of terms in the contract, if there even was a contract. Oftentimes there's not. We've heard of ones literally on the back of napkins. So it varies so widely. It's very nuanced, but again, by and large, a lot of what we heard are about the challenges people face. I think it also depends on who the seller is, right? That does affect the kind of contract.
Right.
And is it corporate? Is it individual? Is it someone who's churning through and just trying to make money off of people renting and never really has the goal of selling the home? There's a lot of sort of very kind of unsavory acts that go on, and in some places it's governed by law and it's legal, and in other places it is not, and it's a scam.
Right. I was going to say it also depends on what state you're in and what kind of laws you have around these things, and also like the way these things exist. These housing schemes exist in a place because the access to the financing is what is the issue here. Just historic discrimination in lending, and reason why people take out predatory loans, and these kinds of things compound. So it creates this space for these kinds of housing schemes. So we definitely have a lot of work to do there, which we're not going to get into all of that. We could take up the rest of the day on that. But I did want to ask a couple more things, and we'll open it up. You mentioned, Daryl, some good best practices in a rent to own. So what is a successful rent to own supposed to look like? Is there kind of like a sweet spot between 5 years, 10 years? So what is a successful rent to own to both? Daryl first.
A personal example, the most successful, the person had a huge student loan debt and didn't have the down payment, and they knew the seller on a personal level. I believe the parents were friends, and the contract essentially stated if you paid this $90,000 on the 10-year installment or before that date, I hand you the title clear as day. This person sold some different things. I think it was some stocks, and came up with the money in like a 5-year term, paid, the title was immediately signed over to them. But that's a very unique situation. I think a shorter term and kind of a clear cut. And once you said access to finance, you do need a place to stay. Lack of funding, student loan and credit score, generally the reasons. But I think a short term with clear definition of when the title will be handed over and easily to enforce. Everyone is not an attorney, but some of those basic contracts, you can go over there. The clerks will help you out, and you can file your own claim over there in the General Sessions Court, and at least have your cause of action. Once again, we don't have a clear law here in Tennessee. Sometimes it's a landlord-tenant act, which we do have, or sometimes you treat it as a homeowner or just a general contract dispute. But short terms with clear definition of when title will be handed over is the best case scenario, in my opinion.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Tara, are there any best practices in rent to own in other cities that you know of?
So we haven't dug in there yet. We're kind of in the early stages of research, but our plan is to just start, now that we have the law scans, start looking at what it looks like on the ground. So there's kind of the legal side of it. What is the state doing in terms of the laws that govern these kinds of arrangements? But, what does that look like for residents? Because a lot of this turns on enforcement and implementation. So, as I mentioned, there's about a dozen or so states that require land contracts to be recorded, but not every state does, because the enforcement isn't strong. And there's just not a lot of incentive to record if there's no kind of stick on the back end if you don't record. But other states, they don't have a law, but people still record because there's just something about the culture of the arrangements in that state where people do. And so we want a better sense for that. And in the future, next phase of the project, probably in the next year and a half or so, we're going to move to thinking through policy framework and recommendations, and we'll have a much better sense for practices and how we think about outcomes. What is the goal for people, and are they able to achieve that and access the options that they want?
Right. And again, I think, as you're going through the rent to own, just continuing that communication, especially, I know with housing counselors, making sure that we're, checking in on a regular basis. Do you still want to own this home? Are you ready for this? Well, just keeping that communication going. And with that, I'm going to open it up to the audience here for questions. And I actually see one in the chat from one of our partner agencies, Fraser CDC. Sharia Jackson asks, how do you factor in the responsibilities of maintenance for rent-to-own borrowers? And should the responsibilities be on the landowner, or the rent-to-own borrower? Do y'all know that? I mean, that may be like a state law or local law, but
yeah. Generally, it depends on how you treat it per the contract. If you're a pure renter, even in that rent-to-own contract, the upkeep as far as basic maintenance, which is kind of broadly defined as far as cleanliness, but plumbing, roof, any type of problem that should be on the owner of the property. In the event you default or you decide, I don't want this home anymore, it's still their property. You can walk away free and clear, even if a tree falls on it. And that's another point. Some of the contracts determine who keeps homeowner insurance, which is something that's needed on the asset. If you're not responsible for it, a storm happens, you can walk away free and clear. You'll be out of your money, but technically, you're not the owner of the property. So it just depends on the contract, on who keeps up the maintenance, fixtures, outside, inside, or basic maintenance.
Yeah, I would honestly just echo Daryl's point. So much of it turns on not only the state law, but what are the terms of the contract. And when a lot of state laws do not specify what language or provisions you need in the contract. And so in those places where it falls into this gray area of, well, it's not exactly a landlord-tenant agreement, so now it's just a contract between two people. Some states do say you got to define up front, like, what this looks like, what fees will be there. You have to disclose X, Y, and Z. Some states get really specific and granular about that. Other places, not so much. So it's a lot of variation. There's not really a standard template out there, unless it's a corporate operator. And even then there's a bit of variation.
Right. And so it kind of seems to me then, as housing counselors, and, Sharia is also one of them, this is something that we can add on to when we're doing our one-on-one counseling, or even our homebuyer education classes, what to look for if you are going to get into a rent to own, what you need to see in a contract before you enter into it. So these are just kind of the educational points that we have. We do have another question, and this is directed towards Daryl. Who has the insurance on a rent to own property? I think you mentioned that is kind of in the contract, but we have seen some renters have rental insurance even though they own it, and so there's other there's some nuance to that too.
So and it's kind of the blurred line, in my opinion. In the predatory scheme, all onus usually falls on the renter. They are responsible for the taxes, the homeowner insurance, paying whatever the arrangement is on the fee, but it goes back into the contract terms. If it's not explicitly stated, it should go on who holds the title. But if it's in the contract, everything usually falls on the renter in the rent-to-own contract, and that's where the issue is. If you miss one payment, you've been paying the taxes, the homeowner's insurance, and they can boot you out the home and start a new contract. So it just depends on the contract terms. And like I said, some state law speaks on it, but it depends on your area or what location you are. But every property that's in a rent-to-own needs some type of insurance, in my opinion.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that we've been seeing as housing counseling agencies, is that we've been seeing people that are not on the deed, they don't own it, but yet they're still maintaining it. And when they run out of funds to keep it up, and they try to borrow, and then they realize that they're in this kind of scheme. So that's, I know, a common, not necessarily that common, but something that we've seen before. So I'm also going to touch on what we can do locally here in our neighborhood. So what are some of the ways that community development corporations. How can we help? What role can we play? And I think this is also what our organizer is asking, in helping to acquire home repair loans, grants, but also help, get the word out about what to look for and combat some of these scams.
All right. Tara, you want to take this one?
Should I restate it?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going all over the place because I have my questions, then there's questions coming in. So I guess my question was, how can we, what are some best practices to avoid these scams, and how can the neighborhood groups kind of help in that effort?
As a Memphian, I think just advertising and letting people know in these community groups, at least read over things before you sign, and whatever the issue may be. I saw another question come up about reverse mortgages. If you're an elderly person, the home equity line, if you don't need the money versus even a rent-to-own contract, just have someone else. It's always good to get a second set of eyes, especially in some of these more developing communities. Like I said, branching out from downtown, a lot of those communities are being developed. Our midtown is being developed. A lot of new apartments going up, so the land value is going up as well. It's a trickle down effect. But just having a second set of eyes read over it, because sometimes it's a good situation. If you need the money, you can take it out, or if it's cheaper to do it that way, as long as it's a intact concrete, especially on a fixed income. You're going to have this income for 10 years. That might be a good situation for you, but have someone read over it. Specifically a community program or an attorney.
I'll note that nationally, one of the biggest evidence gaps I've seen, and we hope to figure this out, and I think it's something that can be really helpful as you think through how to get in front of people, is we just don't know how all the ways that people are finding or coming to these arrangements. So from the evidence we currently have, I'd mentioned that sometimes people are living in the homes and they were offered the opportunity to own it by their landlord, who said, I want to sell this. Do you have any interest in buying it? There are those instances. In others, someone applied for a mortgage and they were turned down, and the real estate agent has connected with kind of like a lender, sort of a second time around lender that would say, okay, we can do a lease purchase here if they're denied for that mortgage. And so they find it through more formal channels like that. For others, it's familial or friends. Sometimes it's they saw a home that they liked, but the only option to get it was some kind of seller financing or land contract. But we just don't know kind of the breadth of options that people have when they're looking to purchase. Was it an active choice they make? Did they not have access to mortgages? I think in kind of with low-cost homes, that's more likely to be the case, is that just mortgages aren't being offered for those homes. And so what are people's options? And when they're at that point of deciding and mortgage ready and credit worthy, can afford to make these monthly payments, that seems like a really important inflection point, and like exactly where you operate, Amy, it sounds like. But it's really tough to find folks and identify that moment when they're making the decision, and understanding more about their pathways into these. And I think for us, we need a much better handle on that. Before we can start kind of informing policymakers about what the right kind of access points are, and policies that would help expand, again, people's access to safer, more affordable credit and protected arrangements and agreements.
Right. And these are such personal decisions, right? So people are going to their friends and their family to ask about this when we're thinking about it. And then a lot of our resources that we have are we can't get the word out. A lot of people are saying you're the best kept secret. And Daryl, you mentioned marketing. We definitely need to get the word out more about what resources are available to people. I do say that there's a lot of a few more questions in here. And one is kind of getting at, there's been predatory lending in the past, and, we do have the Community Reinvestment Act, and there's they're talking about reforming some of that. And, Wells Fargo is identified with these practices. What kind of financial programs can, we come up with, or have there been that have resulted from some of this? I know that Wells Fargo has done a down payment assistance program here to remove that barrier to homeownership. And so what are some ways that we can help drive policy when these things happen to make banks and other predatory schemes, change their ways, I guess.
I really like thinking about this question because I think it really dovetails pretty well with people's pathways. So for some, down payment is a challenge. And so you can think about like the policies and programs if you find that that's what's really the hurdle for people to access mortgages or get into safer, more protected financing. You can think about programs that would help with that issue. If it's something about credit history, credit score that's preventing people from accessing mortgages, I can see a slew of policies and programs I've heard of around the country, obviously you're very familiar with, that can help people overcome that challenge. If it's that the homes in your communities, because they're lower costs, just lenders aren't making mortgages as that rate, that's another conversation. And so again, it's sort of tying like, what is that specific hurdle people are facing? And I imagine it's a mix of all of these things. And so what's that program or policy? And there's really good examples around the country that other states have come up with, other localities, and it can be, again, at the county level, can be at the state level, can be regional sometimes. It just depends on who the sort of service provider is. But mapping those two things, like what is the hurdle people face in becoming homeowners? What's the challenge to getting into the home they want or getting the credit that they need versus, what's available to help them overcome that.
Yeah, and similar to what Tara's saying, it kind of goes into that financial literacy aspect of it. What are your goals? What realistically can you afford for a safe, clean home is what most people want. And also school district, and that's a factor that comes up. But it's setting a goal and there are different programs through the federal government, through HUD homes, as far as down payment assistance, credit score, things to help boost their credit score up. And once again, I'm not aware of how much, but rural housing, usually zero down, is usually in the more rural part of the county. But you have neighbors, safety, and all those different things. So just look at different avenues. And I think, once again, different programs, first-time home buyer programs, and different things like that can help give all the information out other than a rent-to-own or a traditional mortgage. There are about 10 options to home ownership, and one or two might be good for you or none of them. So just different avenues of getting the information out to people. It's probably the best thing.
Yes, and I think we as nonprofit community development agencies and housing counseling agencies, a lot of us locally have like these small dollar mortgage programs or home repair loan and grant programs, and getting those capitalized at the level that the need is there. So the need is always more than the capital that we have in these funds. So I think that is one way that we can work with, some of these bank settlements and others to get the funding to the communities through community development agencies. And I think that gets a little bit to Mr. Lee's first question up there. But I think we're running short on time. I'm keep looking at that. We have a couple of minutes, and Director Cash did mention the "we buy homes, I will buy your home" kind of things that a lot of us have been getting. So before we end today, I do want to get y'all's thoughts on that. What is that? And what I have people, I know some folks may have fallen for some of this, especially if they've been in distress and can't keep their mortgage up. They may sell their home for less than what it's actually worth. So can y'all touch briefly on that?
Generally, we buy homes. The flyers on the phone pole generally are scams. There are some I would say almost hedge funds. There are corporations who do buy properties where they see a development coming, and they'll pay you, pretty much pay your mortgage off and let you get from under the house, not necessarily cheating you out of it. But usually we buy homes. They kind of go to distressed people who are behind on the mortgage, and kind of buy you out for. You might have equity even if you're behind on a mortgage payment or behind on a home in general, and they just buy you out just to give you relief. So I think those are generally targeted to developing areas. They can get the property cheap, or even buy the lot next door to a person's home before development may come 10, 15 years down the road. So those are things that they kind of go towards poor areas or older people, to be honest. So that's something to watch out for. And in my opinion, it's not all of them not scam, but a majority of them are, like 9 out of 10 possibly.
Right. And again, that is something that, we as housing counselors need to make sure that we're talking about when we're talking with homeowners, something to look out for, that you may be in distress but do not just short sale yourself. Tara, did you want to add anything to that? Okay.
No, it's just really interesting to hear about. It's not an area we study, but just personally, I live in Washington, D.C., and we see them all over the place in the city. And I'm often curious, who is it that's, putting up the signs, and, like, are those all scams? Are they legitimate? So that was really helpful, Daryl. I was just interested to hear that comment. Thanks.
Do we have time for one more, or am I out of time? I guess I can ask one more, maybe, because Mr. Green's question here, I'm a little bit confused about. If somebody already has a first mortgage, is there alternative financing? Is it legal? I mean, I'm not sure what I guess it depends.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Daryl. Were you gonna?
No, it depends, but I still think the issue, you can take out a third mortgage if you want to, but a lot of people don't understand the consequences. But in the bankruptcy concept, the first mortgage trumps all. So if you can get rid of them in the bankruptcy, you can strip the second and third mortgages. However, that's on your credit score for 8 years. You still owe that mortgage, and you generally won't have any equity for a long time if you have a second mortgage on your home. But some people need them. It's another way, kind of a home equity line. Sometimes it can be a second mortgage, but that should be your last resort if you can, if you're financially strapped. But you can take out second mortgages. I don't think people fully understand what the consequences are, or what that means exactly. You have to pay both mortgages, and the second usually a shorter term than your first mortgage in some instances.
I'll just add to that. Really good question. We've seen across states where some people will, more like individual sellers, and it seems to fall kind of into this area of sort of not legal scam arrangements, where someone has a mortgage with a bank for their home, and then they offer the home as rent to own to someone else, but don't disclose that there's actually a mortgage on the home. And so we've seen, we've heard of examples from legal aid, the in-depth interviews we did with legal aid professionals across the country, that in some instances the seller left, took off, passed away, something, and then the person who was in that rent-to-own arrangement actually didn't own it, because they didn't realize that a bank actually had the mortgage on the home behind it. And in a lot of bank documents, you'll see they say you cannot legally finance this home while we have the first lien on that home, while we have the mortgage, we're holding that, because of it gets really complicated then with title issues. And as Daryl said, that first lien holder is the one who would get all the proceeds from the sale. They're going to be made whole again, but that rent to own, lease purchase, land contract person, whomever, they could lose everything. And unbeknownst to them, because there's not often a requirement that you have to disclose if there's existing financing on the home already. That's a really good question. And again, like, falls into this really complicated legal area.
Yeah. Well, I think we are out of time, and I do notice that Mr. Brooks is asking about personal credit and down payment, less of a barrier. These housing schemes exist in this space because of that lack of access to financing based on some of these very rigorous credit issues. And I think that there is some movement to start looking at rental history as a part of your credit when you're looking to become a homeowner. So hopefully we can see some of that. But I think I'm out of time, so I am going to stop us right here. And I want to thank our panelists so much for all of this great information that you've shared. I can hear the applause in the background, but so thank you guys so much for coming. And Twarla, do I send it back to you?